Ibrahim Traoré was assassinated at his desk in the presidential palace in front of 200 bodyguards. The moment the bullet pierced the silence of the presidential palace, it wasn't just a man that fell. It was an entire continent's breath that caught in its throat. At exactly 11:46 a.m., President Ibrahim Traoré, hailed across Africa as the lion-hearted son of Burkina Faso, was slumped forward across the mahogany desk that had once belonged to revolutionaries and kings. His pen, still uncapped, rolled silently off the edge as the crimson bloom on his white caftan spread like a whisper no one dared to interpret. And surrounding him, frozen like statues in disbelief, stood 200 elite bodyguards, armed, trained, useless. Outside, the dry wind blew across Ouagadougou as if nothing had happened. But inside the grand office where dreams were drawn and empires resisted, history had just changed course. There was no breach, no warning, no invader in sight, just the echo of a single shot from nowhere and everywhere. The cameras in the room went dark seconds after, while across town, television screens and radios lost signal. Within minutes, mobile networks began flickering. Social media access across the country vanished like a puff of smoke. And silence, that terrifying kind of silence that only follows assassination, crept like poison through the capital. Back in the palace, confusion roared louder than gunfire. Ministers raced in screaming his name. Some dropped to their knees. Some simply ran. General Umar Bazi, the man responsible for Traoré's internal security, stood pale and breathless, eyes darting at the still body, sweat pouring in rivulets down his neck. How? That was the only word anyone could manage to form. The room had biometric locks. 2 full security clearances were needed to enter. Every bodyguard had been personally vetted by the president himself. No gun was fired from outside. No drone had entered the perimeter. And yet, the lion had fallen at his own desk. By 12:30 p.m., the National Assembly was under lockdown. The vice president had disappeared. Army barracks across the nation received coded transmissions in unknown cipher. And in the eastern border region, French surveillance drones flew closer than they had in months. Rumors spread fast in the alleyways of Bobo-Dioulasso and the cafes of Koudougou. Was it the Americans? The French? Internal betrayal? Or something darker? Something ancient? But what no one knew, not even the ministers weeping over his body, was that the man lying in a pool of blood wasn't Traoré. Not truly. What they mourned was an image, a story, a symbol meticulously crafted over years of resistance, rebellion, and fiery speeches. The man they thought they knew had died long before the bullet reached him, and the truth, the horrifying truth, was buried not beneath his body but within the mind of a janitor who had just left the palace minutes before the gunshot. That janitor, a silent elder named Kossi, blind in one eye and ignored by all, was now halfway to the northern desert with something far more dangerous than a weapon, a memory, because Kossi had seen who pulled the trigger. And it wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a foreign assassin. It was someone Traoré had once called brother. The desert has a way of revealing truth slowly, like heat bleeding into cracked earth. Kossi, hunched and wind-worn, walked without looking back. In his canvas satchel, hidden under rags and a tin bowl, lay a blood-stained access card and a shattered communicator device, once encrypted, now useless. But what mattered wasn't the tech. It was what he had seen, not the shot, not the blood, but the face of the one who raised the gun, Colonel Bakare Diendere, once the foster brother of Traoré, once a freedom fighter, once hailed as the Leopard of the North. They had shared a single mud mattress in a rebel camp 20 years ago, sharing dreams of a liberated Burkina Faso. But as power dripped into their veins, like the slow venom of a black mamba, one had risen for the people, and the other for himself. What the public didn't know was that Bakare had been quietly removed from presidential duties 6 months earlier. Traoré had ordered it personally after discovering a dossier labeled Citrine, a secret French operation, a betrayal in the making. Bakare had met with foreign officials in Niger, leaked military blueprints, and most damning of all, attempted to create a splinter faction within the Burkinabe military. But Traore hadn't exposed him. He couldn't. Not because of loyalty, but because of fear. Exposing Bakare would mean tearing open the story of their youth, their rise, their shared ghosts, the village they had abandoned to flames to survive. So he offered Bakare a quiet exit, an advisory role abroad. No noise, no shame. Bakare, however, didn't disappear. He embedded, silently, patiently. Traore trusted 200 guards, but what he didn't see was that the walls themselves had turned, the surveillance, the networks, the codes. And on the morning of the assassination, Bakare walked into the palace with a clearance card only 2 people in the world possessed. He was in uniform, he was smiling, and he was unarmed until he wasn't. The shot came from within 3 feet. A silencer masked the blast, but the impact was unforgiving. And by the time the guards realized what had happened, Bakare had dropped the gun and raised both hands in surrender. That was the real genius. He didn't flee, he didn't hide, he knelt, weeping, as if broken by what he had done. Assassination? No. Bakare would say he snapped, that he had heard voices, that the stress, the betrayal, had driven him to madness. He would spin grief into performance, and behind closed doors, the puppet masters in foreign embassies would prepare their new plans. By sundown, flags were lowered across the Sahel. Radio channels declared a national week of mourning. African Sioux. Union envoys requested emergency sessions. The world grieved a man they couldn't control, and they were relieved. France remained silent. The United States issued a carefully worded statement praising his efforts toward regional stability. No mention of independence, no mention of sovereignty. But in the hills above Wahiguya, rebels wept real tears. In a dusty village with no running water, an old woman slapped her chest and screamed, "You said he would not die," as if calling out to the gods. Children sat silently at fireless stoves, schools closed, markets locked. Fear returned like a sandstorm, and Kosi kept walking north. He carried no weapon. But in his mind, he held a truth too heavy for any coffin, because before leaving he had found a message, a single phrase hidden under the desk drawer where Traore kept his father's prayer beads. It read, "If I fall, do not mourn me. Finish what we started." Kosi knew what that meant. Traore hadn't feared death. He had expected it, but he'd left a plan, a second phase, a spark to be lit, and it was buried in a mountain bunker near Djibo. That's where Kosi was going. But he wasn't alone. A drone had picked up his movement. A convoy was already on its way, and in the heart of Ouagadougou, General Umar Bazi made a call to Washington. Because the truth wasn't just that Traore was dead. The truth was, they had all known it was coming, and no one had done anything to stop it. Long before the bullet, before the betrayal, and before the world wept, there was the deal. It was made not in Burkina Faso, but in Geneva. Beneath polished chandeliers and over crystal glasses of wine, none of the African ministers drank. It was discreet. It was cruel. It was final. The West could not afford another Sankara. Not now. Not after Mali. Not after Niger. Not with a continent shifting in favor of its sons. Traore had become dangerous. Not with bombs or bloodshed, but with ideas. He spoke of Pan-African unity, of resource control, of removing French military bases and expelling foreign mining firms. He visited Moscow without warning. He sat with Chinese investors without intermediaries. And worst of all, he turned his people into believers. That was unforgivable. So they resurrected the oldest trick in the colonial playbook, divide and conquer. The CIA didn't fire the bullet. They didn't need to. They whispered in ears. They opened accounts. They offered immunity. And when Traore refused a proposal to renew American lithium contracts in the Sahel, Washington didn't threaten. They waited, because they already had their answer. Bakare Diendere. Bakare was once loyal, a revolutionary, but the revolution had starved his family, erased his name, and left him playing second to a man who once begged him for a sip of water in a rebel cave. Pride. That's what they bought. Not money, not weapons, just wounded pride, sealed with a promise: you will rule, and no one will know. By the time Traore received the intelligence, it was too late. The American. Drones had stopped circling his compounds. French envoys had become unusually quiet, and foreign media started highlighting unrest in Burkina Faso, planting seeds of chaos before the harvest. It wasn't war, it was orchestration. Back in Ouagadougou, after the assassination, General Umar Bazi stood in the National Security Room facing screens filled with flashing warnings. Military bases in Kaya and Tenkodogo reported radio silence. Protesters were already gathering at the palace gates. They didn't believe Traore was gone, and when his body was placed in a glass coffin that evening, many whispered that it was a decoy. But General Bazi wasn't worried about the public. He was worried about a coded signal sent 6 hours after the shooting, a signal that could only come from one person, Traore himself. A pre-recorded emergency protocol, labeled Kirikou, Rising, had been sent to several rebel commanders across the border. It included encrypted locations, access passwords, and one final message from Traore: my death is not the end. If you see this, you know what to do. That was the mistake the world made. They thought Traore's death would stop the movement. Instead, it triggered a storm. In the north, in a place long forgotten by maps, Kosi reached the cliff edge of Tambao Ridge, where an abandoned mine had become something else entirely. Beneath layers of rusted equipment and collapsed shafts was a reinforced underground vault. No keys, no passwords, just a retinal scan and one voice command: Traore lives. The doors opened. Inside was no gold, no weapons, just footage, hard drives, testimonies leaked. Documents showing months of negotiation between Bakare and a Western task force labeled Operation Eclipse. Plans to dismantle Burkina Faso's telecom networks, seize satellite access, and covertly re-establish French command bases in Togo and Ivory Coast. Every name, every transaction, every signature. Kosi stared at the screens, silent. He understood now. Traore hadn't just planned for his death. He had weaponized it. This wasn't a legacy. It was a counterstrike. And as Kosi activated the uplink, sending the files to a secure server called Ngoma 1, a simple red banner blinked across every screen in the bunker. The lion's roar has begun. That same hour, across the continent, strange things began to happen. Power outages in 3 French embassies. A hacked live stream showing Traore's final note played on a jumbotron in Johannesburg. Thousands flooded the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry waving the Burkinabe flag and chanting his name. But something else happened that no one expected. In Paris, a prominent defense minister was found unconscious in his home, next to a dossier marked Burkina Compromised. And in Washington, an emergency closed-door hearing convened in the Senate, because the files Kosi had just released weren't just about Africa. They were about everyone. The world now watched, not with sympathy, but with fear. When Traore died, they had expected tears, a funeral, and a slow descent back into silence. What they got instead was a firestorm. The leak spread across the internet in 50 languages. The documents were raw. Names of politicians, presidents, bankers, and oil. Executives exposed like nerves torn from flesh. From Algeria to South Africa, a storm of reckoning began. And at the center of it all, one man no longer alive, but more powerful than ever. In Burkina Faso, something miraculous was happening. Protesters didn't retreat when the tanks came. They stood still, fists raised, refusing to be broken. When the military threatened curfew, mothers lit candles and sat in circles outside the palace, whispering Traore's last words: "If I fall, finish what we started." And then, the unthinkable. A video surfaced, not a leak, not a tribute. It was Traore himself, recorded just 3 weeks before his assassination. In the video, he sat at that same desk, sunlight falling through the windows like divine truth. He looked calm, steady, a lion not afraid of death. "By the time you see this, I will be gone," he said. But I did not lose. I gave my life for an awakening, not just for Burkina Faso, for every nation that has bowed too long. We are not property. We are not pawns. We are sons of this soil. And if they fear me in death more than in life, then I have already won. The video was broadcast not just in Africa, but on Times Square, hacked in by activists. In Paris, protesters gathered at the Eiffel Tower waving signs, "Traore lives." In Brazil, in Haiti, in Indonesia, student groups began calling themselves the New Lions. His voice had transcended geography. His blood had written a doctrine. But behind the glory, shadows still moved. Colonel Bakare Diendere was placed under military arrest, but not in a prison. He was flown quietly to an offshore NATO facility, allegedly for mental evaluation. The official narrative was being twisted, that Bakare had acted alone, emotionally disturbed, that there was no broader conspiracy, but the people no longer believed. They had the documents, they had the names, and most of all, they had each other. Kasi, now hailed as the keeper, refused every interview. He returned quietly to his village in the north, where elders began carving Traore's face into a giant stone wall beside the cliffs. His story became legend within days, told beside fires as if it had happened a generation ago. But for the global elite, the real problem was just beginning. Bank accounts linked to shell corporations began to freeze under public pressure. Protesters shut down gold routes and blocked convoys from leaving African mines. France faced its largest embassy shutdown since the Algerian War. And in the United Nations, a motion passed, one that no one saw coming. The Traore Doctrine, which gave African nations the right to reject foreign military bases without consequence of aid sanctions. It passed by a narrow vote, but it passed. That was the sound of an empire cracking. And in the shadows of Burkina Faso, a new council formed, not of generals or oligarchs, but of farmers, teachers, engineers, and students. The People's Assembly, as it came to be known, vowed to lead without party, without colonial structures. It was raw, unstable, but it was theirs. The old powers tried to retaliate. Cyber attacks, sanctions, propaganda, but for once the people didn't retreat. They remembered the shot. They remembered the silence. They remembered that 200 bodyguards stood frozen. But one janitor, one blind old man, had walked toward the truth, and so they built something that could not be assassinated, a legacy, a movement, an unbreakable roar. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, where his office once stood, there is now only a statue, not of gold, not of bronze, but of stone, with his arm raised toward the horizon. On its base are words carved not by politicians, but by children. The lion died at his desk, but his roar woke the world.